Today I'll be talking about the Revolution and Slavery, a watershed moment. In 1776, at the time of the American Revolution, slavery was legal in all 13 colonies, from New England to Georgia. The numbers varied greatly from colony to colony, and I'll talk more on that later, but slaves were present in all the colonies. At the same time, a sentiment and a movement opposing slavery had arisen in the decade or so prior to the Revolution, but it was not as strong as the passionate, intense abolitionist movement that emerged 50 years later after 1830. So what is the background of slavery in the colonial era? In the 17th century, when the first colonists came, most labor was some form of bound labor, bound by feudal dues, guild rules, apprenticeships, etc. It was the pre-modern period. What we take for granted, free labor, wage, contractual labor, only slowly emerged from the modern era. It was a world of strict hierarchies which inflicted brutal punishment for breaking work rules or committing even petty crimes. That was the context in which slavery emerged. In colonial America, slavery was concentrated geographically in the Chesapeake region, Virginia and Maryland, and in the Carolina Low Country. Tobacco in the Chesapeake and rice and indigo, a type of dye, a plant that's used to create a dye, grew in the Low Country. Slavery was not adaptable to the economies of the other colonies. There were a few slaves in Rhode Island and Connecticut. They tried to grow tobacco there, tried to replicate the plantation economies of the South, but it didn't really work. Most of their economy was based upon shipping, shipbuilding, and fishing, and farming that supplied those activities. And so the economy of the New England colonies really wasn't adapted to slavery. There were slaves in places like, in some cities like New York and Boston and Philadelphia, and they were servants. Virginia, to give you a contrast, if you want to talk about concentration of slaves, Virginia on the eve of the Revolution had 230,000 slaves. Over 40% of its total population was enslaved. South Carolina had 80,000 slaves, about 60% of its population. In the largest slave colony, Virginia, slavery developed over decades in the 17th century. Initially, work was done by indentured servants. They were white, mostly Englishmen from the British Isles. Slavery had disappeared from English law, so that the first black servants that came, and they came first in 1619, had an indeterminate status. They didn't quite know how to treat them, how to consider. Some of them were considered indentured servants and gained their freedom after a term of service. Others, we find 20 years later, were being held for life. So their status was indeterminate for several decades, really. By the 1670s and 1680s, the flow of white labor was drying up. The population growth of the British Isles and the economy in the British Isles was changing, and so that the flow of white indentured servants was drying up. And the Indians, another source of labor that was at hand, didn't prove easy to enslave. They could escape at any time to the wilderness that they knew well. They had allies in the wilderness. It was dangerous to try to enslave them. And the other big hindrance to enslaving them was that they didn't have the immunities to disease that the Europeans were carrying. Whereas the Africans, because they had been exposed along the coast to the European diseases for 2 centuries, had developed immunities to things like the measles, which would wipe out Native Americans in huge numbers. So the Indians proved difficult to enslave. At the same time, the African slave trade, by the late 17th century, the 1680s or so, was supplying a large number of Africans to North America. Virginia adopted its first full slave code in 1705. South Carolina, on the other hand, was developed as a colony from Barbados. Its slave code was brought over directly from Barbados. Barbados is a small island, 166 square miles. It had originally been settled in the 1630s and 40s by whites who used indentured servants to grow tobacco. By the 1650s, it switched to sugar, which was a far more profitable crop. And by the 1660s and 1670s was completely a slave economy in a slave society. Some of the planters came over from Barbados in the 1670s and settled in what is now South Carolina. They brought over with them their Barbadian slave code. It began to thrive in South Carolina. Initially, it didn't thrive very much. They were just growing a few crops and had livestock to support the much more prosperous slave society of Barbados. But by 1700, they started growing rice. And rice was a crop that could feed slaves in the West Indies. It was not perishable or readily perishable. It was pretty easily stored and transported, and so it became profitable. The colony south of the Mason-Dixon line, and that's the Maryland and Pennsylvania border, the colony south of the Mason-Dixon line became slave societies, meaning that their economies, their whole society was based upon slavery. That was the primary means that of production in the society, and it also deeply affected the way that people thought of themselves and interacted with each other, even whites. So they were slave societies, as opposed to those north of the Mason-Dixon line, which were merely societies with slaves. Places like New Jersey, which had 6% slave population, Pennsylvania, which had about 5 or 6, Massachusetts with about 3%. Slaves. They had a few slaves that were used for household servants. Notoriously in Boston, ship captains would often bring back slaves and have them as their servants, but they were not an essential part of the economy or the society. They were a very small element.